In 1787, the founding fathers of our country gathered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to write the supreme law of the land, the United States Constitution. In it, they defined our government and how it would serve the people. They established three distinct divisions of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. In this program, we'll take a close look at the makeup and function of one of these three. The executive branch. From the very start, Americans regarded their government with a mixture of trust and mistrust. The men who founded the American nation knew government was a necessary evil. They realized that human beings are subject to wicked as well as noble impulses. Government, therefore, was essential to maintain freedom and order.
After the founders of our country broke the ties with Britain, they were concerned to establish on our shores a true constitutional democratic republic. Their great fear was to return to a situation where a central government was so strong and powerful that it could become tyrannical, the way the king, the British crown, had become tyrannical.
This was a fearful experiment to create this strong national government. And the Bill of Rights is part of that agreement to add these protections for individuals against the government, and particularly against the federal government at that time. The concern of the framers was that the majority could overrule minority rights. And if you read the Bill of Rights, they are very much concerned with the rights of the minority.
To prevent the abuse of power, two basic principles are written into the Constitution. One, the principle of dividing the power between the state governments and the central federal government. And two, the principle of separation of federal powers into three distinct branches:
an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. And all of these institutions could check and balance the power of the others.
In some respects, the executive branch is the most powerful, since its top government official is the President of the United States.
It's interesting to read Article 2 of the Constitution, that the framers are not as specific as the powers of the executive branch as they are in the legislative branch, which is Article 1.
So we might conclude just from the words on the page that, aha, it's the legislative branch that's the strongest.
That's changed with the 20th century. I mean, the character of the person in the office has made a great deal of difference. The fact the United States is a world power has made a great deal of difference. And the sheer size of the executive branch has made a great deal of difference. So the Constitution, when you read Article 2, clearly didn't anticipate that the executive branch would be as powerful as it is now.
The chief executive is responsible for carrying out the laws of the land and conducting internal and foreign affairs. This monumental task is accomplished through the many law enforcement and governing bodies under the president.
If you want to sort of look at the modern federal government, where the true power lies now, it's in the hundreds of thousands of people that work in this enormous bureaucracy. The bureaucracy really does carry forth the actions of Congress and the mandates of Congress, but that's where government gets done. Talking about executive departments and agencies, but also independent agencies, independent, things like the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. These are all part of, technically, the executive branch, but to varying degrees they have independence from the president.
The Constitution isn't very clear about the president's job description. Article 2, Section 1 simply says
that the executive power of the United States shall be vested in the president.
Section 3 goes on to say, the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Well, those are pretty vague and general statements, and they've had to be filled out over the year, both by legislative acts of Congress and by just the informal politics, the give and take of political reality.
As the presidency evolved, presidents became chief administrators, chief personnel officers, chief financial officers, and chief law enforcers, all part of the job of the chief executive.
Different presidents have viewed the power of their office in different ways. Not all presidents have sought at all costs to expand executive power. In fact, some presidents, Coolidge is a good example, declined to exercise certain powers on the ground that he didn't believe that those powers were really his under the Constitution. Now, there are other presidents, for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who actively sought to expand presidential power.
Take Teddy Roosevelt, for example, who sends the United States Navy around the world. Well, what he does is send them halfway around the world and tell Congress if they want him back, they have to pay to get him back the rest of the way. Very much used the Navy as a symbol of American power around the world and to show Congress he was in charge.
The structure of the federal executive branch under the president's control can be broken down like this. The executive office of the president, with its many divisions and cabinet departments. In addition, our government has various independent regulatory commissions. Many of them report directly to the president, and in that sense are part of the executive branch. Let's look at each of these in more detail. In 1939, the Executive Office of the President was created to help manage the growing bureaucracy of government. Starting with a modest staff, the office has grown tremendously over the years and now employs nearly 2,000 people. The Executive Office of the President includes the White House office, the Office of the Vice President, the Office of Management and Budget, the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, the Office of Policy Development, the Office of United States Trade Representative, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the Office of Administration. The White House office consists of the President's closest assistants. Approximately 400 people work at the White House. The most influential members of this group are the Chief of Staff and the Counsel to the President, who advise the President and direct the other White House staff. Of almost equal importance are the Press Secretary and the Deputy Press Secretary, who arrange press conferences and frequently speak to the press on the President's behalf. The Legislative Strategy Coordinator helps the President formulate legislation, and the Communications Director oversees the writing of the President's speeches and issues policy statements. Other members of the White House office include the assistants to the President for political and governmental affairs, national security affairs, and policy developments. The office of the Vice President is complementary to that of the President.
Well, I think the old joke is true, it has a lot of truth in it, that the primary responsibility of the Vice President is to sit and wait. And he had better keep himself healthy because in a crisis he might very well be needed.
The Vice President constitutionally is supposed to break a tie on the floor of the United States Senate, and there are times when the Vice President has to do that.
Now, that is usually a formality, and it's a formality that the Vice President very often forgoes. But when it comes to important matters, matters that have really engaged the public's attention, the Vice President will preside.
When John Nance Garner was Vice President, he was asked about the significance of his job, and he said the Vice Presidency is not worth a bucket of warm spit, indicating that he had really nothing to do and the job was not very valuable.
The largest of the EOP agencies is the Office of Management and Budget. Its staff numbers nearly 600. The OMB prepares the annual federal budget, which the President in turn submits to Congress each year. Departments and agencies of the executive branch must submit annual budget requests to the OMB. The OMB then estimates what the government's tax revenues will be each year and how the funds can be distributed in order to run the government.
Under our Constitution, it is the Congress that has the responsibility for making appropriations and spending the revenues of the United States.
Now, what the president can do that is very influential is often through the Office of Management and Budget able to issue various projections about various departments and programs and, if you will, play political hardball with Congress in terms of appropriations.
The president has a significant influence in his budgetary recommendations to the Congress, and the Office of Management and Budget plays an important role in that process.
The Council of Economic Advisers keeps the president informed about the state of the nation's economy and helps prepare his annual economic report to Congress. The council, composed of 3 presidentially appointed economists and a small staff, recommends policies to aid national economic growth and stability. In 1947, early in the Cold War, Congress passed the National Security Act, which created the National Security Council, or NSC, to help coordinate military and foreign policies.
The National Security Council is an advisory body which the president uses to help him deal with issues relating to national security and foreign policy.
The National Security Council has 4 statutory members: the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense.
It includes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it includes the head of the CIA.
It is something that's outside the formal structure of the Department of Defense and the State Department, and some presidents make more use of the National Security Council than others.
Yeah, national security is a large concern for the executive branch, and a number of agencies have lots of power here. Almost all of the branches of government have an investigative arm. Naval Investigative Services, for example, the Army has theirs, the other branches as well, all to investigate espionage or leaks or threats of national security.
Another department designed to assist the chief executive is the Office of Policy Development. This office helps the president devise and coordinate domestic strategy in such diverse areas as foreign policy, community development, and school lunches. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative is headed by the President's chief advisor on foreign trade policy. The Trade Representative holds the rank of ambassador and represents the country in all foreign trade negotiations. The Council of Environmental Quality monitors the nation's environment for the President. This council also prepares, on behalf of the President, an annual State of the Environment report to Congress. Like the Council of Economic Advisers, it consists of 3 presidential appointees and a small staff. The Office of Science and Technology Policy advises the President on scientific, engineering, and technological matters that affect the nation. The office researches such topics as solar energy and space travel and publishes reports relating to scientific policy. The Office of Administration assists each of the units of the Executive Office, providing data processing, clerical, and library services, except for the President himself, who has his own support staff.
The Constitution stipulates that the President of the United States from time to time shall inform the nation about the State of the Union, which is translated to the annual State of the Union address. And presidents have used this as the time to indicate to the nation and Congress through the media their wish list, their agenda of what they would like to see happen in their tenure as president.
Because of our direct college loan program, which makes college loans cheaper and more affordable with better repayment terms for students, costs the government less, and cuts out paperwork and bureaucracy for the government and for the university.
It is very partisan. Members of Congress tend to show their support or lack of support to the president by their applause, by their stony-faced silence. There is one intriguing thing about the State of the Union. There is always, by law, required that one member of the executive branch be intentionally absent from the State of the Union, so that if there is ever some catastrophic thing that occurs that everyone perishes, there would be one person left in order to run the country. It's particularly funny when that person is, the Secretary of Agriculture or something that's going to be running the nation if, in fact, everyone perishes.
Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "It is the purpose of the government to see that not only the legitimate interests of the few are protected, but that the welfare and rights of the many are conserved." The cabinet departments of the executive branch of government help meet this purpose. They can be thought of as separate businesses or corporations whose chief officers, called secretaries, make up the president's cabinet, the president's personal advisory board. When a new president is elected, one of his first official duties is naming his cabinet. Following the appointment of all cabinet members, they must be approved by the Senate.
Originally, under George Washington, there were only three members of the cabinet. There was Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State. There was Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury. And then there was Henry Knox, who was Secretary of War, which is now the Secretary of Defense.
The presidential cabinet has evolved from an informal institution to what is now a highly formal and structured one. Originally, it was the president's closest advisors. Now it is the head of the various major departments. These are the so-called cabinet offices of the executive branch of government.
The idea of a cabinet was basically never in the Constitution or any statutes, but it was originally one of the traditions that was created by George Washington as the first president, to have a cabinet whom he would consult with various matters. And that tradition has continued with virtually every single president to a greater or lesser degree.
The cabinet today is not seen as a significant source of advice for the president. There are the top four: the State Department, the Justice Department, the Defense Department, and Treasury. That these four cabinet jobs are significant, and most of those individuals see the president on a regular basis and give the president regular advice. The rest of the cabinet is not seen as so significant. Some scholars have called this the inner and outer cabinet.
None of these offices existed at the beginning. They've been put into place by acts of Congress over the years.
Some presidents have deemed the cabinet worthy of listening to. Eisenhower, for example, actually listened to the advice of his cabinet. Other presidents have more or less dismissed it as, a source of information, but not necessarily one in which they have to take great credo from.
Story of Abraham Lincoln, and that he had been talking about a particular issue, and then they took a vote, and everyone around him opposed a particular idea.
So Lincoln put it to an informal vote, and all 7 voted no. So Lincoln declared, well, we've had a vote. We have 7 nays, 1 aye. The ayes have it. Of course, that aye was the President of the United States, President Lincoln.
The Secretary of State has a special role in the executive branch. After the President and the Vice President, the Secretary of State is the nation's highest diplomatic and ceremonial representative. The Secretary of State conducts negotiations with other countries and protects the foreign interests of the United States. He or she receives foreign visitors who visit the United States and often heads U.S. delegations at funerals, inaugurations, and other ceremonies that are not attended by the President or the Vice President. In matters of protocol, the Secretary of State also is considered to be the highest-ranking cabinet officer. This unofficial rank is reinforced by the Succession Act of 1947, which designated the Secretary of State 5th in line for the presidency, following the Vice President, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the President pro tem of the Senate.
Not all the advice that presidents receive come from people that are formally in positions.
One thinks, for example, of Colonel Edward House, who was a very close advisor to President Woodrow Wilson. One also thinks of Harry Hopkins, who was a close advisor to President Franklin Roosevelt. And then, of course, closer to our own time, there was Henry Kissinger, who before he became Secretary of State, functioned as a very important and powerful figure as a close advisor on foreign affairs issues to President Nixon.
Kissinger becomes so significant, he's later made Secretary of State when the current Secretary of State resigns. But initially that job was not one that came to Kissinger by title, but came to him by the fact that he had the presidency ear.
The wives of presidents, first ladies of the United States, have often had important roles as advisors to the president. Not all first ladies have involved themselves in public policy affairs, but some have, and in important ways. One thinks particularly now of the wife of Woodrow Wilson, who after President Wilson was incapacitated by a stroke but continued to function as president, had an enormous influence by all accounts on public policy making. One also thinks more recently of Rosalind Carter, who sat in on cabinet meetings and freely advised her husband, President Carter, even in the more or less public setting of the cabinet meeting on public policy issues.
The Secretary of Defense heads a huge department that includes more than 3 million military and civilian employees. The size of this department, obviously, is due to the fact that it includes the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. The Secretary of Defense advises the President on such matters as weapons systems, military preparedness, and troop strength. The President's chief economic advisor, the Secretary of the Treasury, is in charge of the Treasury Department's varied functions. This department includes the Internal Revenue Service, the United States Mint, the Customs Service, the United States Secret Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The Attorney General leads the Department of Justice and advises the President on legal issues and represents the government in court. The Attorney General also oversees the Justice Department's various units, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the Bureau of Prisons. The Department of the Interior is directed by the Secretary of the Interior, who is responsible for administering more than 500 million acres of federal land, including the national parks. The Secretary of the Interior also oversees the allocation and conservation of natural resources. The Secretary acts as the President's chief source of information on the nation's water, mineral, forest, fish, and wildlife resources. The Secretary of Agriculture is responsible for the nation's farm-related activities, ranging from loans to soil conservation. One of the department's major responsibilities is monitoring the quality of the nation's food supply. The Agriculture Secretary also administers food assistance services, such as the Food Stamp Program. The Secretary of the Department of Commerce reports to the President on matters of trade, business, and industry. The Secretary of the Department of Labor advises the President on labor-related matters such as employment statistics and occupational health and safety concerns. Some cabinet members spend more time working for the public than advising the President. For example, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. This department administers such services as Social Security benefits, aid to families with dependent children, Medicare, and Medicaid. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development assists citizens through housing programs, such as the Government National Mortgage Association and the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity programs. The Secretary of Transportation directs such agencies as the Federal Aviation Administration and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which are responsible for the safety of public travel. The Secretary of Energy oversees the nation's fuel needs, including the utilization of nuclear energy. The Secretary of Education promotes public education and enforces federal guidelines on equal education opportunity. In 1989, the Veterans Administration, or VA, was raised to cabinet rank as the Veterans Affairs Department. They oversee a host of programs for America's military veterans, including medical care, educational benefits, and housing assistance. 1 month after the tragic events of September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush established a new cabinet department, the Department of Homeland Security. The President's charge to the nation's Director of Homeland Defense was to develop and coordinate a comprehensive national strategy to strengthen protections against terrorist threats or attacks in the United States. Our nation's business is so vast and complex that many independent agencies and regulatory commissions are required to handle the work. The directors of many of these agencies are appointed by the President. In that sense, they can be thought of as part of the executive branch. Some of these include the Central Intelligence Agency, one of several organizations responsible for gathering and evaluating foreign intelligence information vital to the security of the United States.
The CIA's primary responsibilities are enhancing national security outside the United States, outside of our borders, and that's their mandate.
The Securities and Exchange Commission, an agency that protects American investors against fraud in the financial markets. The Federal Trade Commission, charged with maintaining free and fair competition in American business.
Ignition and liftoff of the maiden voyage of Endeavour on a satellite rescue
NASA,
mission.
the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, responsible for space exploration. The Federal Communications Commission, which regulates interstate and foreign communication by radio, TV, wire, and cable. And the Interstate Commerce Commission, that oversees surface transportation among states by train, boats, buses, and trucks. It takes an enormous number of people and lots of tax dollars to keep our government running smoothly. These agencies are all part of the process. Lyndon Johnson said, "A president's hardest task is not to do what is right, but to know what is right." Given the considerable powers of the President of the United States, that knowledge would be a godsend. Another presidential power is the executive order. This power can be used by presidents to establish executive branch agencies, modify bureaucratic rules, or change decision-making procedures.
The power to issue executive orders is an informal power that the President has come to exercise. What it is a little tiny bit of legislative power. Now, you might say, well, the Constitution doesn't give the President any legislative power. The legislative power of the United States is vested in the Congress rather than in the President. Well, this is a case where we learn that these divisions between executive and legislative and even judicial power look nice and sharp and clear on paper, but often they're a little smudgy.
Executive orders are instruments for presidents to deal with the day-to-day changes of government, a rate change, an emergency change, things that legislation would take too long to handle.
Even where Congress hasn't acted to prohibit a certain form of discrimination, the President can issue an executive order not banning that form of discrimination throughout the entire country or even throughout the entire government, but within the executive branch. So, for example, even prior to Congress's enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the President could issue an executive order prohibiting discrimination against the handicapped in federal hiring or in promotion.
Presidents have used the executive order to attempt certain types of civil rights progress that they couldn't get through Congress. For the most famous example being Harry Truman desegregating the Army by executive order. He just did it. And next thing you know, the Army was desegregated.
There are some famous or infamous executive orders. Probably the most is 9066, the infamous executive order by Franklin Roosevelt to inter the Japanese.
A very sad chapter in our history as a nation involved the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. The executive branch decided for national security reasons that Japanese Americans who had been loyal citizens of the United States would be placed in internment camps to protect the national security. Ultimately, that decision was upheld by the United States Supreme Court. I believe that this is an example of a violation of the Constitution which took place with the support of both the executive branch and the courts, and hopefully we'll never see this sort of abuse of American citizens take place again in our history.
By the way, much later in life, Roosevelt was interviewed, and his sons have attested to this, that he was asked once his greatest mistake as president, and he said it was interring the Japanese.
Another key presidential power is the chief executive's responsibility to make foreign policy. Although the Constitution attempted to divide diplomatic affairs between the President and Congress, these affairs have become primarily a presidential responsibility.
One of the things that concerned the founders of our country and prompted them to abandon the Articles of Confederation in favor of a constitution with greater central power was the desire to make sure that there would be a centralized foreign policy of the United States of America, so that each state wasn't devising its own foreign policy in conflict with the foreign policies of other states. And the founders very wisely, in my view, vested much of the power to conduct foreign policy, the bulk of the power to conduct foreign policy, in the hands of the president.
The ability to dominate foreign affairs is probably one of the greatest strengths for a president, because Congress, clearly on equal playing field with the executive in domestic politics, is not in foreign affairs. And presidents really dominate the landscape in foreign policy. This is the leader of the Western world. This is the leader of our country.
Still another important presidential power is the veto, the president's ability to reject a bill presented to him by Congress. By returning the bill to the chamber that originated it unsigned with a message stating his objections, Congress is forced to find a two-thirds majority to override the veto.
When a president vetoes a bill, Congress has a couple of choices of what to do. They can attempt to override it, which is very difficult to do. It requires two-thirds of both houses of Congress to override a veto of the president.
Once both the House and Senate have voted by two-thirds majorities to override the president's veto, the measure becomes a law, notwithstanding the veto of the president.
Repeat after me. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do
The
solemnly
president,
swear.
according to Article 2 of the Constitution, will take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This makes him chief executive over what has become a vast law enforcement apparatus that includes dozens of specialized law enforcement agencies. The most familiar is probably the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. It's part of the Justice Department, which also includes several other important law enforcement agencies: the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Marshals Service, and the Drug Enforcement Agency. The head of the Justice Department is the Attorney General. Law enforcement responsibilities are also given to the Treasury Department, which contains the Secret Service, the U.S. Customs Service, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the Internal Revenue Service, among others. Although it may not be obvious, even the Labor Department has law enforcement duties necessary in regulating labor unions, wages, and enforcing occupational health and safety laws.
You know, we don't really think of the president as being a law enforcement power, but that's because we traditionally only think of law enforcement as uniformed officers.
There are 8 categories of law enforcement within the executive branch of government: economic, social, political, judicial, public health and safety, public resources, public revenue, and national security.
If you think of it broadly, if you think of law enforcement broadly as the ability to enforce regulations or laws of Congress, instead of just thinking of it in terms of a person with a badge.
Under the Constitution, the President, as the Chief Executive, has the constitutional responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Faithfully execute the laws, and laws in all types of areas of life.
One example of the law enforcement authority of the executive branch relates to the Food and Drug Administration, which has responsibility for helping ensure that foods and drugs are safe.
And economically, for example, under the executive branch, there's an agency called OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Employment Agency, whose job is to ensure safety regulations in the workplace.
Also, you have the Department of Energy enforcing, energy laws.
The U.S. Marshal Service allows the executive branch to ensure that there's judicial enforcement.
The Department of Defense ultimately having its own, code of military justice.
EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, whose job is to ensure fairness in the workplace, anti-discrimination laws to be enforced.
The IRS having control over the Internal Revenue Code.
The FAA to regulate airlines and safety on airlines.
Secret Service.
The Treasury Department has a number of agencies that help them execute the laws.
You have the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
The Postal Service, the Parks and Wildlife Department.
The real thing is that the President is the ultimate authority for all these departments, which have enormous regulatory control over vast sections of our nation.
In times of crisis, the President is authorized to use his emergency powers. These actions are taken to preserve the nation and protect the American people. Presidential emergency powers include the authority to call out federal troops or to take control of state militias to quell domestic unrest or to deter violence. During the 1950s and 1960s, presidents relied on federal troops or state National Guards to ensure calm in situations involving racial desegregation. In 1957, Dwight Eisenhower sent troops into Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce desegregation of the public schools in the face of resistance from state officials and angry mobs. John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson after him also used troops to protect civil rights marches on several occasions. The President's emergency powers also come into play when the nation is hit by natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and earthquakes. By declaring a region a natural disaster area, the President sets in motion the government machinery that can provide immediate aid, such as food, shelter, and police protection, not to mention longer-term assistance, such as federally guaranteed low-interest home and business loans. And during wartime emergencies, the President can use his war powers to make key military decisions.
The President has certain emergency powers. The Constitution was designed to ensure that in a truly grave crisis, the President could exercise greater powers to be able to rise to the occasion and protect the country.
These include not only when and where to wage war, but also considerations like restricting civil liberties, exerting greater control over the economy, seizing industry, fixing wages, and settling labor disputes.
In the case of President Truman, who seized the steel mills in the country and a declaration of a crisis, ultimately the courts found that that was not justified and was not within the president's constitutional authority.
In 1934, Chief Justice Hughes, in a case, dealt with the question of emergency power of the executive. And he profoundly says that emergency doesn't put the Constitution on the shelf. It doesn't put it away. That emergency doesn't diminish the law that is in existence and allow the executive to respond to threat. He does say, though, that emergency may expand some of the given powers the president already has, so that they can enlarge some powers they currently have, but not necessarily negate the ones that are in existence.
Finally, the president alone decides when and if the nation will use its nuclear weapons. Harry Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the only time this has happened. The executive branch of our federal government is huge and complex, but hopefully now you have a better appreciation for the job of the President of the United States. He may have many agencies to help do the job, but the burden of responsibility that rests on the President's shoulders is awesome. Dwight Eisenhower made the observation, no easy problems ever come to the President of the United States. If they're easy to solve, somebody else has solved them. Harry Truman had a more colorful way of saying it. A sign on his desk declared to everyone entering the Oval Office, "The buck stops here."